Hi, my name is Uri Ferruccio, and I'm here to talk about DAOs. I guess very briefly, I work at BNB Chain, which is a layer 1 protocol, and DAOs are a very significant interest for us right now, so I'm excited to have the opportunity to be here. So I suspect that most of us here, if we're at consensus, probably have heard of DAOs and probably know what they are. But just to lay the groundwork, I'll go over some of the basics before we dive into some of the things that I think are very interesting in terms of the potential of DAOs, and then some of the areas where there are still a lot of difficulties and unsolved issues, right, that we need to be real about. So effectively, a DAO it stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization, and like a lot of jargon in our industry, it's not particularly accessible. It's basically an entity which is governed entirely by its community, or mostly by its community, depending how they're designed, who collectively make decisions about things that are critical to the future and the present of that entity. It's pretty abstract, but what it means is that essentially these things are decentralized, which means there's no central authority. So instead of a CEO, the DAO, the members of the community vote on decisions, and usually there's a kind of a predefined threshold for how much support you need for a decision to go in one way or the other way. They're also autonomous, meaning that these things are built on top of smart contracts that lay the foundations for the rules. And these smart contracts, they execute based on inputs, and they put out outputs, right, that are determined by the rules that make up the governance for the DAO. Let's see. They're also transparent, and they're less hierarchical than traditional modes of governance. And I think these can be classified as benefits. So in terms of transparency, you have the visibility of having smart contracts, the rules of the game, visible on chain in code. You can go audit those, you can look at them. And the voting is also visible as well. And they're non-hierarchical in the sense that, once again, you're moving away from a kind of, command and control structure with a king or a CEO or whatever it may be, and moving towards some version of community-led. We can get into some of the versions later. So these are things that I think generally are considered good or high potential when it comes to DAOs. When it comes to applications for DAOs, I think we're still in the very earliest innings here. And in fact, like with a lot of crypto or a lot of decentralized applications, I think about an article that I read a long time ago, I don't know where, that talked about what happened when movie cameras were invented. I think that the first narrative activities that were filmed once motion picture cameras were invented were stage plays, because people didn't know what else to film. And if you think about a film stage play versus like a modern movie, you can see how much the understanding of the limitations of a medium have developed. I think what we're using DAO for right now are, in many cases, the most obvious use cases. But these include things like venture capital and investment DAO. That's where investors put their money into a pool and they vote on the investment opportunities that they think the DAO should make. Charities, which do the same thing, but they allocate the value to causes or to projects. Gaming guilds, communities for collectibles, these things are all very similar. A lot of what you're doing is seeing value allocated or decisions about what technology to build next, right, for a protocol being made. And here's a little landscape of different types of DAOs. And I think, again, there are probably some that I missed, but some of the better known ones are Pleaser DAO has been in the news. That's a sort of collectible DAO. And this is a DAO where the members, they raise money for the DAO, and they allocate by purchasing digital collectibles that they believe will be historic and will retain value over time. And this is beneficial to the artists because it's raising up digital collectibles as a space. right there. But it's also, hopefully something that, if done well, will actually create value for the DAO over time. You also see things like investment DAOs, as I mentioned, grants DAOs, which are sort of similar, but they're less focused on making a financial return. Actually, in DeFi, a lot of the most famous protocols like Uniswap and Compound and Aave function as DAOs, and Earn as well. There are many, I think, very similar applications here. I think one thing that probably doesn't get enough discussion, though, still are the limitations of DAOs, because there's a lot of hype. One of the main illusions about DAOs that you see people talk about is that DAOs bring more equality and more democracy. But actually, DAOs suffer from the same types of challenges that voting systems, suffer from around the world, in a traditional context. So, for example, there's a lot of voter apathy. People just don't exercise their rights as a community member to vote. And that can cause, a very small number of people to have a huge influence. The kind of complement to that is whale dominance, right? Because if you're a whale and you have more tokens, and your voting rights are determined by the proportion of tokens that you have a lot more power, right? Sort of naturally. And there are a number of things that are being explored right now to help with this. One is that, as with a lot of things, right, I think the DAO governance concepts are going from, one thing to another extreme and then looking for the happy middle ground. And, if the first DAOs were, totally proportional voting, and they suffer from voter apathy and also sometimes a lack of expertise in the average community member, moving towards voting for delegates who sometimes, who either are willing to be much more engaged and vote regularly, or also have specialized expertise. Like maybe they're investment professionals who represent a much broader variety of investors who've put money into an investment DAO as limited partners, who can kind of bring that investment experience and make sure that best practices are being followed. These are things that are being explored at the moment. Also, conviction voting and quadratic voting, which basically let the community vote not just on the basis of how much rights they hold in terms of how many tokens they have, but how much they care about something. So they can basically buy extra votes if something really matters to them. That's being explored right now, and it's pretty interesting. And the other thing that I think can be tricky is that right now in an on-chain context in crypto, there's a lot of anonymity, or pseudo-anonymity anyway. And I think the development of decentralized ID, which is a way to prove the uniqueness of a member of a community without actually revealing their identity, that's something that will bring more accountability, potentially, to DAOs. There's also a lot of inefficiency that DAOs have, and I think that the lesson that we talk about a lot is not everything needs to be decentralized. I think it's easy to forget that sometimes when you get excited about the hype. But ultimately, it's difficult to scale DAOs beyond Dunbar's number, like 100 to 150, which is, I think, the number of people that you can sort of know well personally, right, in your associate circle. That dynamic means that DAOs can be very slow to change and adapt. They can be pretty short-sighted. They can be very inefficient. There can be a lot of log rolling and bike shedding, as they say. And what this means is that so far, the DAOs that work well, they only do very simple things for the most part. And there's a lot of work to be done to develop more sophisticated models, or at least better design models. Maybe not more complex models, but things that account better for a lot of these inefficiencies. Let's see. Here we go. Some of the things that people are working on, and I think that some of these that go beyond just DAOs in this space, include, for example, what do you put on-chain versus off-chain? If it's on-chain, right, it's transparent, it's indelible, and it's sometimes more costly and time-consuming, depending on the chain that you're on. For example, if you're on Ethereum and there's a lot of usage of the network, it can be quite inefficient to do a vote. This is one of the reasons why ApeCoin, the DAO for ApeCoin, has been having a lot of debates recently about whether they stay on Ethereum or move to another chain like like BNB chain or some other ones. Moving that off-chain, of course, makes it much faster and less expensive and more responsive. And so deciding what really needs to be on-chain and what can be done using a traditional tech stack is super important. But this is not just true for DAOs. This is true for finance and DeFi and everything like that too. I think also hybrids that combine DAOs with traditional corporate structures are really interesting to think. Like, there are obviously some things where having like a singular vision is really valuable. Like most books are written by a single author rather than multiple authors. There is an element of converging to the mean, right? Whenever you have multiple parties trying to come together on something, and that can inhibit creativity and efficiency. And so, for example, a lot of projects are using DAOs to make decisions that should be decided by the community very clearly. Like, where should we build next? What new functionalities should we build that are going to make our users happy? It's a very good use. And maybe they don't let the community decide on certain things that require a lot of specialized expertise, like what jurisdiction should we put our new entity in, and things like that. And then ultimately, I think also having a reputation system that will allow us to kind of track the participation of different members of the DAO without revealing their identity, built on top of decentralized ID, that could be really helpful as well. So ultimately, I think that DAOs right now remind me a lot of a quote that I'm gonna mangle. I think it was Paul Graham, who basically said that when it comes to recognizing innovation, usually it looks like a toy when you first see it. It doesn't really work very well. It doesn't necessarily do very much that's useful in the world. And the best thing to do is to start playing with that toy when you recognize it, because within a few years, it's not going to be a toy anymore. It's going to be something that's really useful and really impactful and potentially really new. I think we're kind of there with DAOs, and so I think they're really worth playing with and really worth exploring. I think probably 2 or 3 years from now, you'll see much more robust structures emerge that do more and that look more like corporations, or at least can achieve many of the aims and do the activities that corporations do effectively. That being said, we are extremely, at BNB Chain and the broader Binance ecosystem, we are really interested in supporting that innovation and the development of it. And these are some areas that we think are worth looking into now. One of them is sort of DAOs as a service and disruptive DAOs. I hate the word disruptive, but I didn't know what else to put in there. But basically, things that are pretty simple and function as kind of operating systems for important fundamental parts of the ecosystem, like treasury or governance. In general, decentralized governance right now is becoming more explored with things like city coins. Things like that are very interesting use cases. The next generation of DAOs that are focused, I think in particular, on use cases where community is really at the forefront, like creator platforms that are trying to use tokens to build better engagement, right, between creators and their communities. DAOs are a great tool for bringing people who do things and people who are excited about following those people closer together and creating more interactivity at scale, which is cool. We are interested in venture DAOs. I mean, I personally am still skeptical at the capital allocation efficiency of a collective, but I do see some DAOs performing pretty well, and I think that's something that we want to explore and support. And of course, I think infrastructure is super important right now for DAOs, as it is for many other areas. But I think as the infrastructure improves, it makes it so much easier for people who are designing governance to do so efficiently. So we're obviously very, very interested in infrastructure layers for DAOs. I think that's about it. I don't know if we have time for questions or who determines that here, but happy to take questions if anybody has any. Which specific DAO or which type of DAO? I think it's really tough to say what the most robust and functional one is, because it's so early, and a lot of DAOs, they haven't been around long enough to really get tested in whatever context they're in that much. ApeCoin's a great example. Like, I think these types of and robustness comes in many forms, right? They're technically robust. I mean, DAOs are not technically particularly complicated. The governance is the tricky part. And getting the governance and community designed right is the tricky part. I think ApeCoin is a really interesting one to think about, though, because a lot of people have been hearing about it, right? Right now, it kind of needs to move away from Ethereum, at least for a while, because Ethereum 2.0, it's going to take a while before it can bring the kind of efficiency and lower cost transactions that it needs. So where does it go? Does it go to a chain which is part of the Ethereum ecosystem? It's most likely, I think, because there's a lot of support for Ethereum in that community. You've seen a number of votes, right, to proposals that have been put to the community, and we won't know really if the result of this voting is good or bad until we see more time pass, until we see more congestion hurting ApeCoin if it stays, or the success or failure of a move. And I think that's where a lot of DAOs are at. This is so new that honestly, any DAO that says we're battle tested, I would be skeptical. But I think things like that are really good, but they also show you the risk, right? So does the average ApeCoin holder understand the technical intricacies of network congestion in, a layer 2 on Ethereum versus the Ethereum main chain really well enough to kind of make a good decision for the good of the ecosystem? I think probably there is a lot of knowledge. It's a pretty sophisticated audience from what I can tell when I go read the articles. But is this something that like a chief architect should be deciding? I don't know. It's still an open question. I think on the whole, I tend to be biased towards letting the community decide when there isn't a clear reason to not. I don't know if that's a good answer to your question. Okay, thank you.
I'm curious to know if you have any examples of media DAOs. So I'm wondering if that more referring to like content creation or media in terms of
Yeah, so I think in general, what I think is interesting about media DAOs, there's a couple of areas that you can apply DAOs to in media. Probably the most interesting one, to be honest, and I haven't really dug into how much people are doing this, would be using DAOs to help decide what media focuses on. And this is both, like, this is a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, I think DAOs could be an amazing counterbalance to what people often talk about as sort of the, I don't know if it's like the ivory tower, but the kind of, the media as this self-contained thing that makes its own decisions and has its own biases, its own agendas. If you have a DAO which helps to determine that agenda, that could help to counteract that. But then the problem, right, is that you also want the media to some extent be a gatekeeper, right, and to be something that brings up problems and challenges and issues that people don't typically think about, and that maybe that people need to be educated on, right? And so it's a great example of how right now I think media, not in the sense of journalism, but media in the sense of media is probably an easier application for DAOs. But if you want to apply them to media in the sense of journalism, there are some groups that I've heard of kind of starting to explore this, where part of some journalist or part of a newsroom could focus on areas that the DAO votes on as important. I think that's pretty cool, and it also could help to counteract what I think is an increasing gap between the population and the media, and sort of trust of media, which seems to have fallen quite a bit over the last X number of years.
So I come from the world of film. So when you said media, I thought that's where my. I'm curious to know if you have any examples of, like, in terms of film, you have a lot of independent filmmakers.
Yeah.
Whether they issue tokens, they have a DAO, maybe the DAO owners provide some guidance on what kind of participated or have you seen any of that?
Yeah. So I'll try to be brief. Actually, one of my grad degrees, although I've worked in tech and finance for most of my career, was an MFA in creative writing from NYU. So I've thought a lot about this, and I saw an amazing documentary at a Filecoin event a couple nights ago. I don't know where they're going to distribute it, but it's all about the effect and the potential of NFTs, not DAO specifically, but NFTs, on letting content creators both own their IP and also own their distribution, eventually, potentially, right? If things in a happy path. That's obviously potentially revolutionary, because it's never been easy to be an artist. right? Probably there's a golden age illusion that we have, which is that it was better to be an artist before the internet created zero marginal cost, distribution, copying, screenshotting, et cetera. But I think if you look back, realistically, only the artists that are the most popular or the most patronized were the ones who sort of had a high standard of living, historically speaking. Starving artist is a common phrase for a reason. And I think that if you look at not just DAOs, but the potential for DAOs and other applications of decentralized technology, content creation and the arts is one of the most interesting areas. So DAOs, I think, are interesting from the perspective of potentially allowing artists to have a closer relationship with their stakeholders and their communities, and to maybe create art in a more interactive way, right? Create art that sort of speaks to concerns that the DAO identifies, for example. But also, if you look at the potential for crypto or financial applications of decentralized technologies, to be a better way to raise film financing, that's also something which is being explored by a lot of different projects right now. And there's a lot of middlemen, right, in the film industry, which potentially, they take value that could potentially be given back to the creator, so to speak. So I think that this is an area where DAOs are useful, but it's also important to kind of think of DAOs as only one in a variety of different approaches across governance, across financing, that could disrupt that industry in ways that could be really interesting. I actually don't know how much time I have, but let's see. Okay, I think if no other questions, I think that's about it. Oh, go ahead. I'm so sorry. Quadratic voting. So quadratic voting is one of a number of approaches that basically focuses on trying to make it possible for people to vote in proportion to how much they care about something, not just in proportion to how much what percentage of ownership they have of governance tokens, or of whatever you call the rights to vote are. And I think the reason for that is that it comes back to the psychological dynamics that make voting complicated. In the traditional world, right, there are certain countries that make it illegal to not vote. I think Australia might be one of them. I always thought that was very interesting, right? Obviously in the States it's not illegal to not vote, and many people don't vote, especially in midterm elections or local elections. Quadratic voting and similar approaches are exploring different ways of, I guess, you can think of it as making people put their money where their mouth is. Like, for example, if I'm an ApeCoin, holder, and I want to buy extra votes, maybe I have one vote, but I really, really, really am tired of, losing money or losing my ApeCoin or whatever because of network congestion. I can go and I can stake some of my tokens and buy extra votes, basically. And there's a psychological, I think, data point that you get when someone has to pay for something that's very interesting to incorporate into governance, right? This is why some events charge you a nominal amount to buy a ticket, even if they don't care about the money, right? Because it keeps away people who just will do anything if it happens to be free. So I would say this is just one approach of a number of approaches that people are trying to get higher quality inputs to governance systems, I guess, would be a good way to summarize it. Okay.
Where do tokens and DAOs get their value? I know that together.
Right. No, that's a great question. So the question was, where do tokens and DAOs get their value from? Probably the underlying question is, where do tokens get their value from? And I think that's a long conversation, right? Ultimately, one of the biggest problems that we have in this industry is that for a long time, we've been building a technology in search of use cases. And I think we're getting closer to having enough integration, enough sophistication and reliability in different applications of blockchain and crypto technology, and enough integration points between that technology and the rest of the world, traditional Web 2 technology stacks and what have you, that you'll start to see Web 3 or crypto or whatever you want to call it actually employed for things that create value for people and for the world. I think that's going to happen a lot faster now that more very significant Web 2 companies and governments are starting to use, tokens or use chains to do things. But of course, tokens don't have any inherent value. A token is a representative of something. And so if you don't have some kind of underlying value, or if you don't have some kind of use value that gets created, you can create perceived value or temporary value through artificial scarcity, but it doesn't have fundamental value. I think a great example actually for this, that it could be really cool, is the applications of tokens to high volume, low monetization use cases like, say, online media, like print media online. Think about Google. Why does Google make so much money? Anybody have any thoughts on that? It's just a really simple website. You just go to it, you put in a search query, and it gives you some results. Say what? Well, data mining, yes, but the direct source of revenue is advertising, right? But advertising is actually a pretty inefficient monetization approach, right? What is the conversion rate for a typical online ad? Anybody know? There's got to be at least somebody who's done some online advertising. It's I think 1% below, give or take a couple percent, or less than 1% is pretty common, right? For the ads that you see displayed on the side of the browser window. That goes to show you that it's quite difficult to show someone what they want to buy when they want to buy it without getting more data. And it's difficult to do that in particular for print media when the way that we consume information is changing. So one of the reasons that Binance, which is part of the BNB chain ecosystem, took a stake in Forbes, a large stake in Forbes, is that we believe that over time, the ability of crypto and tokens to reduce the cost of value transfer and to reduce the friction for value transfer, while also giving people who hold tokens, if you design it the right way, kind of upside in the entity that the tokens have a claim to, so to speak. And then, of course, the ability to design token systems so that they are incentivization loops, very flexible incentivization loops, can let you try, different approaches for monetization. Would you pay a fraction of a cent to read an article from your favorite columnist on the New York Times? Probably. You probably wouldn't pay $5. Probably wouldn't pay $1. You might not pay a quarter, maybe a dime, but certainly some fraction of a cent you would probably pay, and you wouldn't even think about it. That's just human psychology. Now, in aggregate though, if you've got 100 million monthly active users, that adds up. That could be a much more sustainable model for this type of organization than ads. And that would be great, right? Because I think all of us at this point, however you feel about media, recognize the need for independent media to A, be more independent, and B, to be more sustainable, because it's getting harder and harder just to keep the business models going. Maybe I went a little far afield there, but I think that if you go down the rabbit hole of where does the value of a token lie or a DAO lie, I think the value of a DAO clearly lies in the tokens. The value of where the token, where the value of the token comes from, that's the bigger question. And I think we're still in the process of really developing that and proving that we can achieve the potential that we believe this technology can achieve in that context. Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. I hope that this was interesting.